Hi, I'm Dave Soucie. I was a church pastor for 30 years in the Christian church. For the past 13, I've been a hospital and a hospice chaplain. I also spent years as a volunteer Boy Scout chaplain and a little bit of time as a fire department chaplain. You should already have a list in front of you, or you've gotten it sometime, of 10 different types of chaplain specialties that I put together. And these are things that different types of chaplains have contributed. I don't really have anything to add to that. I can talk about hospital and hospice, I can talk about scouting chaplaincy, but I don't have anything to add to what those people said because they're the experts, they're in the middle of it. What I would like to do is just go have an overview of the role of chaplain that's going to be common for really all different types of chaplains. I'm going to resist the temptation to tell you a story about every single point I'm going to make. And I have lots of stories, but I'm going to resist that temptation. One, what's the difference between a chaplain and a pastor? When I'm asked that, I tell people, and they're fairly familiar a little bit, maybe what a pastor is, and I'll tell them a pastor's there for the entire community, young, old, people who know a lot about the Bible, people who have never looked at a Bible, church livers, people who have never been in the church at all. You're there for everybody. A chaplain is a specialized pastor with a much narrower demographic. So, a prison chaplain will deal with the prisoners, maybe their families, and the staff of the prison. A police chaplain will deal with the officers and their families, maybe the suspects, maybe the victims. A hospital hospice chaplain will deal with patients and their families and the staff. It's a much more specialized role. There's a lot of overlap between the role of a chaplain and a pastor, but they're not exactly the same. Likewise, there's a lot of overlap between the different types of chaplaincies, and although they all have some similarities, each of them are also going to have their distinct differences, which are reflected in that list that I'd already shared with you. So most of what I'm going to be able to share comes from my perspective as a hospital and hospice chaplain the last 13 years, but a lot of it still relates to the experiences of the other different types of chaplains. As a church pastor, you have to be very intentional in getting away from the church building and church people and church programs in order to interact with the secular world. When you're a chaplain, you're right in the middle of the secular world. I mean, that's just where you are. These people did not pick you as a spiritual leader. They didn't come in and decide that they're going to automatically give you some trust and respect. You've invaded their space. You may have shown up unannounced. If you go to a church, you kind of assume that the pastor has some kind of authority and he's someone worth listening to. That's not true for chaplains. And you've just shown up, and they may have absolutely no interest in what you have to say or what you might be able to do with them. All pastors need to earn the right to be heard. That's even more true with chaplains because they don't know you and they're up against a lot of problems that I'll address in just a few minutes here. Chaplains cannot be proactive like pastors can. So if you're a pastor and someone in your congregation is living an ungodly lifestyle, you have an obligation to jump in there and tactfully, diplomatically, pastorally, as their shepherd, deal with that. You can't do that as a chaplain because they didn't pick you. You just showed up. So you have to be very careful and diplomatic, and you have to choose your battles. There are times in which somebody will, they're living, you can tell it's a pretty ungodly lifestyle, and they may say something just to get their reaction from you. And in those occasions, I'm looking at them and I don't respond to what they said. They know what I said. I mean, they know that I heard what they said, but I don't respond to that. I just go on. And sometimes silence says something. And I would like to think they noticed that I didn't respond. I didn't affirm whatever it is that's going on in their life. So sometimes you have to deal with that, but again, you're there to build a relationship and you see if it can go further. You can't assume that all the other staff in your organization is supportive. You assume that in the church, 1 Corinthians 12, body of Christ, we're all on the same team. That may not be true in whatever organization that you're particularly in, especially some of the people higher up in the organization. Again, it all depends on the setting and the organization and what's going on. So some of them are maybe They may be allies, and they're very happy that you're doing what you're doing. Others are not happy that you're there at all, and they're not supportive at all. And you got to keep that in mind, and that helps direct you on what you can get away with as a chaplain. 2, many people are far more likely to encounter a chaplain than they are a pastor. What's the number one way to avoid a pastor? Well, just don't show up at a church. You just have nothing to do with the church, and you're probably not going to encounter a pastor. You might at a wedding or a funeral, but pretty much a lot of people know how to avoid pastors. As a chaplain, you just show up, and you're there, again, invading their space. You may be the first person that they encounter that has some kind of a ministry role. Now, those of you who have spent your life in the secular world, you may have encountered more of that, that people may have understood that you're a believer, but you're not really getting into things, the spiritual things, as much as you would as if you were a pastor or as a chaplain. But you're there to build some respectful relationships. You see where that can go. Maybe you can plant some seeds. You're there to be salt and light, to be that presence of Christ. You need to demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5. We're talking about an incarnational ministry where you're living in their lives and letting them know that you kind of understand what they're going through. And this is really frightening, but you may be the very first and last time they ever encounter Jesus. And that's scary. That's frightening. That's a terrible responsibility, but you have to be mindful of that and try to do what you can to represent the Lord of love. They come in with prejudices and preconceived ideas about clergy. And where do those ideas come from? If they've never met a pastor, if they don't know anybody in ministry, where have they gotten their ideas about pastors? Well, it comes from what they've seen in TV shows and movies. Not good. TV preachers, even worse. Terrible stories about abusive cults and naughty preachers that make the news. Exaggerated stories from their favorite uncle. Some politician that they really disagree with who makes religious comments. You're up against all the mistakes and the abuses of the church over the past 2,000 years, and somehow you're guilty by association. Now, is all that fair? Of course not. But that's their preconceived notions about who you are. And you have to be up against that, and you have to be willing to accept those assumptions and build a respectful relationship, some credibility to establish a rapport. And maybe you can get past that by showing them that their preconceived notions are not accurate. You need to be non-threatening and establish that rapport. You're showing them that it's okay to talk to a pastor. You're not yelling at them. You're not beating them with a Bible. You're not, we don't bite. You're letting them know it's okay for them to be able to talk to a pastor. And you're encountering all those negative stereotypes that they already have. I think for a number of pastors, probably the closest equivalent might be a community outreach event where you are doing blood pressure checks for the community, or you're working a food bank or a food pantry, and maybe you're passing out car seats to low-income families, car seats for their kids. You're doing something to build credibility within the community and just getting out there and letting people meet you and realizing that it's okay for them to talk to you. So that may be the closest equivalent from a pastoral setting versus what you're going to have as a chaplain. You might plant seeds, and you might not. Both Jesus and Paul talk about the importance of planting seeds, and you might have a chance to do that. Sometimes I think all the chaplain does is break up the sod, and maybe somebody else can plant a seed. And if that's all that gets accomplished, we're making progress. So you've done something to help them begin to understand that maybe you have something of value, something of worth, and you may be able to plant seeds, and you may not. But you pray that at least somebody can. And it's very possible that on this side of forever, you're never going to know what's going to happen to this person. This may be the only time you ever meet them. And you may have other opportunities. It depends on the setting and the organization and what's going on and why you're there as a chaplain. I learned as a chaplain that what most people think they know about God, the Bible, Jesus, and the church comes from misinformation from their uninformed family and friends who may have little or no idea what they're talking about. So you're up against all this misinformation on top of all those prejudices. And sometimes I hear the most outlandish, crazy stuff, and your first instinct is to jump in there and do some theological damage control. And you got to control yourself because you have to pick your battles carefully. And you can't go in there and correct everything. Because you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were the 4 apostles. And Jesus ran off with Mary Magdalene and moved to France and had a kid. And God lets evil people live long, healthy lives and kills off the good ones. And you hear this stuff and you want to jump in there and correct all that. Again, you got to pick your battles, be careful, diplomatic, gentle with these people, very selective in what you decide to address. I think that when you can address some of that and you're able to be gentle and diplomatic and you're not building barriers with them, you're letting them know that maybe they don't know as much as they think they do, and that's a win. That's a start. You build relationships. You're giving yourself more of a chance to talk to them later on, and you just don't know exactly where that's going to go. And you may end up becoming their de facto pastor. And that may end up leading to weddings and funerals more likely in my case, some counseling, some baptisms. You just don't know where it's going to go. 3, who are these people? I have to go through this very, very quickly. All of this is very brief review, but this is going to be even faster. You see those surveys out there that talk about X number percentage of the population have no faith at all? Don't trust that because you don't know how that information was collected. I have all kinds of people on my list from the hospital that are identified as having no faith, and it's not true. They may be a lifelong Baptist, and they're listed as a none, N-O-N-E. Likewise, the term non-denominational is now useless. It used to mean something, now it means something else. I've had atheists that consider themselves non-denominational. Some people just consider them, and I've written an article about that. It's very frustrating. Some people are just theists. They believe there's a God, but that's as far as they can go. Some people identify themselves as spiritual, not religious. I hate that phrase. I wrote an article about that. I love talking to agnostics. And they may or may not even know the term, but I determine that they're agnostics. And I'll say, there's a lot of things I don't know either, and I really appreciate your honesty. And then I plant this nugget of truth in their heads that I would like to think inoculates them against going further and denying the existence of God altogether. I'll go, I'm really glad you're not an atheist, because to be an atheist, you have to believe that you are capable of understanding all truths of the known and unknown universe, including that which is completely beyond your experience and totally outside your frame of reference. It is the height of human arrogance to claim that if you don't personally understand something, it's impossible. We have a word for that. It's called delusional. And then I just pause. I let that sink in. They have no comeback for that. There's no response from that. I'm sorry, there isn't. And then I may say, if sometime you want to talk about it, I'm available, because you can't be pushy. I'm available. And I may not bring it up again. If I'm able to continue to visit with them, I'll keep tossing out bait. We'll see what happens. And it's a start. The term Protestant, at least here in America, is useless. It doesn't mean anything. Basically, it's a cultural designation. Some people assume that the Baptists and the Methodists and Lutherans, that's 3 different religions. And I have a thing I go through them on that, on how 99% of all churches agree, et cetera, et cetera. They may define Christian much more loosely than you and I would. I've had people say, Christian, I guess. Well, that doesn't sound Acts 2:38 to me or to you, but it's where people are, that's where they start, and then you just see where you can go with that. You have to treat them as the spiritual infants that they really are. 4, how open can you be with them? Well, it depends on the setting and the organization. You may not be able to be very evangelistic with them at all. You have to wait for them to open the door for that. I toss out bait. We'll see if they take it. Sometimes I can lead people through a plan of salvation. You start simple. Maybe you can go deeper later on. I'm going to guess, I don't know this, I'm going to guess that a prison chaplain and maybe a military chaplain is better able to be evangelistic. But I don't know. There are times in which I find ways to slip in some doctrinal truths, which is a pre-evangelistic approach. And so the first time I have a prayer with somebody, my generic prayer is, Lord, thank you for your kindness, for giving us love and life, and offering us grace and peace. Well, we know, you and I know, that God loved us before we were formed, and then he gives us life. Grace and peace are optional, offered by God to everyone, but it's not automatic. It doesn't cram it down our throats. So we have to choose to accept it. Now, the patient or family, they may not pick up on that subtle difference, but they might. Now, as you know, and let's admit this, when you are been a believer for a long time and you've heard 10,001 prayers, we've been known to tune out when someone's praying. Our mind drifts because we've heard so many of the common phrases. We may not be paying attention. These people are probably paying attention. Maybe the only time they've ever heard someone utter a prayer is on a TV show or movie. They've certainly never had someone pray in front of them, for them specifically. And they may be hanging on to every single word you say. So, they may pick up on that subtle difference. I'll end the prayer in one of two ways. If they are really sick, especially end of life, I'll say, Lord, thank you that you are always there and you always care and you will always love us. You know, they've not been abandoned. God does care. God loves everyone, and you want them to know that. But if they're not so sick, I'll probably end the prayer with, thank you for your generosity, and then I'll pause and let that word sink in. And patience, pause. And help us to never take either one of those for granted. It's really easy to take the things of God for granted. Even Christians do that. So you've planted this idea in their heads that, well, have I taken some things for granted? You know, you're giving them this notion here that, you know, maybe I need to pay better attention. And again, they may or may not pick up on that subtle difference, but they might. There are times in which, you know, when you're praying, you're addressing the Lord of heaven, but the prayer is supposed to be, in my case, for the patient, but my real audience are the other people in the room. I want them to hear, and they may pick up on those subtle differences and those little nuggets of truth. And so I try to share that with them to get them starting to think about what their own relationship with God. People's reactions. Some people are very eager to visit with you. These are usually good church folks. I love those visits. We don't nitpick about differences. These are allies, not adversaries. I have devotions that I go through with them, you know, to reinforce their faith and to talk, in my situation, about their maybe end of life, about the presence and care of God. 2, some people are polite, but not really interested in spiritual things. So I'm there as their friend, socialization and companionship. They are sick of hearing about being sick. They're sick of looking at doctors and nurses and tubes and needles and equipment. And I'm there to talk about other things. And that's just a relief for them. And I can start to build a relationship, and hopefully they like my visits. I pass out a TV channel guide, and I have a whole routine. I go through that with some humor. I make them laugh. And coincidentally, on the backside, there's a whole bunch of free movies. And amazingly enough, some of them are Christian movies, which I tend to highlight. So even if they're not crazy about spiritual things, they know that the chaplain gave them something of value, and they hang on to that, and it becomes the reminder of my visit. 3, some of these people are polite but dismissive, and they want me out of their room ASAP, immediately. Now, you can't take that personal, because their reaction to you is based on all those preconceived notions that they've already had about clergy. They've known you for an entire 20 to 30 seconds. It's not about you. You're just there to try to build some relationships and make jokes about the TV schedule, etc. 4, some are impolite, derisive, and they want you out. They want you gone. They want nothing to do with you. They find your presence threatening because you remind them of things they have long ago rejected or ignored. And my opinion is, if I've made them uncomfortable, that's a good thing. I want them to be uncomfortable with me being there at first, because it kind of reminds them of things that they've rejected in the past. Again, you're there to build relationships. My favorite visits are with seekers, people who truly want to know, they want to grow in a faith. And I'll talk about the importance of finding a good church and why, the church can help. There are some passages in scriptures I can guarantee that people are going to misunderstand, and the church can help us understand what the Bible's really saying. So I talk about that. Lastly, common beliefs. Now, those of you who've spent most of your life in the secular world have probably encountered a lot of this, but if you're going to be a chaplain, you may hear more of it. And I heard some of these things as a church pastor, but much, much more as a chaplain. I hear, oh, he was a good man, so we know where he's going. Well, that's a works theology. And at least in America, the default pop theology is that everybody goes to heaven. I have had atheists talk about going to heaven. I have no idea how that's supposed to work, but that's what they believe. God needed another angel. God won't give me more than I can handle. I hate that phrase. I wrote an article about it. I will respond to that one. God must be punishing me. I'll respond to that. Why is God killing my grandma? I'll respond to that. Oh, he believed in God, so we know he's going to be okay. Don't worry, God and I are good. I've already taken care of that. My mother was a godly woman. I don't need anything. My wife's very religious, so if I'm going to get to heaven, she'll take me. All religions are the same. Now, if they're talking about denominations, that's one conversation. If they're talking about world religions, that's a different conversation. A conversation you may or may not actually be able to have with them. Sometimes you really have to bite your tongue because you have to pick your battles. I do think that sometimes when I don't agree with someone, that sends a signal. I just look at them and then just don't respond. Again, it all depends on the setting and the organization. It depends on whether or not you've had an opportunity to build a relationship. It may not be the time or the place. It just all depends. Sometimes they'll say something I don't agree with, and I'll look at them and say, well, if you want to talk about that sometime, I'm available. And then I try to be available. I think not agreeing sends a signal. Many of them don't want that conversation because they know that you're going to end up challenging them in ways that they don't want to be challenged. And they don't like that. So they may not want to talk about it at all. But again, if it makes them a little uncomfortable, maybe that's okay. I'm always praying for a tactful comeback on some of those things. And if you have some brilliant ideas, I would love to hear them. I'm at davesoucie@hotmail.com, and just send me an email. I'd love to know more tactful ways that I can respond to people without building additional barriers and walls. Again, this is an extremely brief overview of chaplaincy, but it's all we really had time for. I had to skip a lot of details, and you didn't hear a lot of amazing stories. Thank you for your time.